Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of China Focus, the podcast where we shine a focus on the folks, the everyday people, their unique experiences, and the vibrant tapestry of life across China. I'm your host, Robert Jean.
And I'm Ella.
We all tend to put a lot of faith in certain institutions, don't we?
Yeah.
Especially hospitals, medical schools. We want to believe they run purely on merit, on competence.
Right, that dedication and skill are what matter most.
But then a story like this one involving Miss Dong comes along, and it really shakes that foundation, makes you question things.
It does. And this particular case, which you asked us to look into, really forces a hard look at how these critical systems actually work, or maybe how they sometimes don't work as intended.
Yeah. We've looked at quite a bit here, news reports, chatter from inside the medical world, some broader analyses, official statements too, trying to piece it all together.
Our goal here is really to unpack what happened with Miss Dong, understand why it caused such an uproar, and see what it tells us about opportunity and maybe privilege in these important fields.
Okay, let's dive right in. Who is Dong Xiang, and how did she end up at the center of this?
Well, she started with an economics degree from Barnard College, which is already a bit different. But the really unusual part is her entry into Peking Union Medical College's 4+4 program.
The 4+4 program. What exactly is that?
It's an 8-year track designed to get people with non-medical bachelor's degrees into medicine, aiming for an MD. The idea was to bring diverse backgrounds into the medical field. Recommendations are part of how you get in.
So bypassing the typical pre-med grind, that sounds, well, potentially open to issues. Was her application straightforward?
Far from it, actually. That's a huge part of the controversy. It turned out the transcripts she provided were falsified.
Falsified, how so?
They showed she'd completed required pre-med courses, things like university physics, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, 16 credits worth. But she hadn't actually taken or passed them.
Wow, okay, so she basically faked her way into one of the top medical programs.
That's what the findings suggest. It wasn't just a mistake. It points towards a deliberate misrepresentation to get a spot in a super competitive program.
That alone is pretty shocking. But the problems didn't stop once she got in, did they? Her doctorate work raised eyebrows too.
No, they didn't. Her doctoral dissertation was flagged. For one thing, it was really short, only 61 pages total, and the main part was just 31 pages. That's unusually brief for a general internal medicine doctorate.
31 pages. Anything else?
Yes, and this is significant. Over 20% of it showed a major overlap with a patent filed back in 2022. And that patent belonged to a team from Beijing University of Science and Technology, BSAT.
BSAT. And isn't there a family connection there?
Exactly. Her mother is a deputy dean at the Sex Research Institute. So that connection obviously adds another layer of suspicion about the dissertation's originality. Was there influence involved? It's being looked into.
Okay, so questionable entry, a dissertation that's short and potentially plagiarized. Any other academic red flags?
There were. Several academic papers she was listed as an author on had issues with improper authorship. Plus, one instance of duplicate publication publishing the same thing twice.
So multiple counts of academic misconduct, really. It casts serious doubt on her research integrity.
It absolutely does. Yet, despite all of this, her career seemed to be on a fast track.
How fast?
She moved into a residency at the China-Japan Friendship Hospital relatively quickly, and then landed a position at the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences Cancer Hospital, which is very prestigious.
Which, given the academic background issues we just discussed, seems surprising. It fuels that perception of preferential treatment, doesn't it?
It really does, and that rapid advancement became a huge focal point for public anger.
Now, the way this all initially came to public light wasn't directly about her grades or papers, was it? It was tied to another doctor.
That's right. The whole thing blew up partly because of Dr. Xiao Fei, who worked at the China-Japan Friendship Hospital. His wife reported him.
Reported him for what?
Pretty serious ethical violations, affairs with multiple colleagues, including Dong Xiang and also a head nurse. But it got worse.
How so?
There was an incredibly serious incident during a surgery. Dr. Xiao Fei allegedly stopped the operation with the patient under anesthesia for a significant amount of time.
He stopped surgery. Why?
Apparently, it was because of a dispute. A nurse had criticized Dong Xiang for attempting some improper surgical procedures, and the argument escalated to the point where Xiao Fei halted the surgery.
That's horrifying. A patient put at risk because of this.
Exactly. The consequences for Dr. Xiaofei were severe, kicked out of the party, fired, lost his medical license. But that incident, directly impacting patient safety, really amplified the public outrage.
It makes you seriously question the standards when someone with Dong's background is involved in surgery, especially at a place like China-Japan Friendship Hospital, which has a history built on, well, on donations and support aimed at advancing medical care, at healing people.
It feels like a betrayal of that core mission, doesn't it? The idea of treating the sick and saving lives seems completely undermined in a situation like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And was it around this time that people started looking more closely at the 4+4 program itself?
Precisely. That incident opened the floodgates. Online discussions popped up, including from someone claiming to be a former doctoral student at Peking Union. They pointed out weaknesses they saw in the 4+4 program.
What kind of weaknesses?
Mainly that the initial 4 years didn't provide a strong enough foundation in basic medical science for students coming from non-medical backgrounds. They argued this lack of rigorous early training, combined with the recommendation system for admission, basically created
Loopholes
for people with connections to get in without, perhaps, the same level of basic knowledge or aptitude as traditional medical students. This person even suggested Dong's papers were likely fraudulent, maybe ghostwritten by someone connected to her aunt, who also held a patent.
So the program designed to diversify medicine might have actually lowered the bar and become a backdoor for the privileged.
That's the fear and the accusation. It taps right into that deep-seated concern about meritocracy being eroded.
And the details about Ms. Dong's family background seem to fit that narrative perfectly, right?
Oh, yes. Reports emerged detailing her extensive family network. Her father, a general manager at a major construction research institute. Her mother, the deputy dean at Basay. And apparently multiple other relatives holding positions as doctoral supervisors at Basay.
That's quite a network.
It led to this public perception of 3 layers of academic privilege, as some called it. The idea that her path was smoothed by these connections, not necessarily by her own abilities.
It definitely feeds that feeling that the system is rigged against ordinary people, the ones from the cold door trying to get ahead.
Exactly. And it got even more specific. People pointed out online that her father, an engineer, and her mother in material science were listed as corresponding authors on one of her medical papers.
Wait, her engineer father and material scientist mother were corresponding authors on a medical paper.
That's what was reported. Highly unusual, to say the least. It just added fuel to the fire, reinforcing the idea that connections could trump qualifications and even standard academic practices.
So how did this all play out officially? The timeline seems crucial.
Well, it seems the initial report by Dr. Xiaofei's wife acted as the catalyst. That brought scrutiny onto Xiaofei, then his relationship with Dong, and then inevitably onto her own background. The public outcry was massive, just waves of anger about the perceived unfairness.
Which forced the authorities to act.
Yes, the National Health Commission launched a formal investigation, and their findings essentially confirmed the key allegations: academic fraud and violations of regulations.
So what happened to Ms. Dong as a result?
The consequences were pretty severe. Peking Union Medical College revoked her graduation certificate and her degree, and then the Beijing Municipal Health Commission stepped in and revoked her physician qualification and her license to practice medicine.
So she's officially stripped of her credentials. End of her medical career, presumably. Yeah. What about the 4+4 program itself? Did the investigation find systemic issues?
It did. The National Health Commission's review of the program at Peking Union identified some serious problems. Things like not properly verifying admission qualifications, like Dong's transcripts, issues with how clinical internships were managed, weaknesses in the thesis defense process, even problems with student ideological education.
So a systemic failure, not just a one-off.
It certainly pointed to vulnerabilities. The university is now undergoing a major evaluation and has to implement corrective measures. It's an admission, really, that the program needed fixing and was susceptible to manipulation.
Which makes you wonder, were there other students in that program with, let's say, unusual paths or backgrounds?
That definitely came up in online discussions. People shared anecdotes, students supposedly coming from arts backgrounds or geology, sometimes with big jumps in their Gaokao scores just before getting into this medical program, even transfers from things like civil engineering.
Any way to verify those?
That's the problem. Accessing past admission lists for the program is apparently quite difficult, which just breeds more suspicion, It makes people think Dong's case might just be the tip of the iceberg. The lack of transparency is a real issue here.
And didn't the education consultant Zhang Suifeng weigh in on this too, about the challenges for ordinary families?
Yes, he did. His advice was pretty stark, basically telling families without strong connections to be very wary of pursuing medicine. He pointed out the intense competition for PhD spots and said that upward management skills, essentially, connections were vital for getting ahead in the medical field.
Upward management skills, a euphemism for knowing the right people.
Pretty much. It really reinforces that narrative that merit alone might not cut it in these high-stakes fields.
This whole saga, the Miss Dong incident, it really forces us to confront that big, uncomfortable question. Can someone from an ordinary background from the cold door actually still make it? Can they climb the ladder based just on hard work and talent anymore?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And one of the analyses we looked at tackled this head-on. It argued that Dong's case is like Exhibit A for how the rules just don't apply the same way to everyone.
How so?
Ordinary people might strive for years, follow every single rule to try and get into medicine, but for someone with the right background, it's like, and this is a quote, he only needs to snap his fingers and the doors of China's top hospitals open for him. That contrast is just brutal.
It implies the system itself is broken, or at least easily bypassed by the powerful.
It suggests that pathways meant for advancement can become tools for reinforcing privilege. The analysis compared the 4+4 program potentially to historical recommendation systems like the Peugeot and the Han Dynasty.
How does that relate?
Well, that system was initially meant to find talented officials, but over time, powerful families took it over, using it to place their own relatives in positions of power, solidifying their control. The worry is that the 4+4 program, relying on recommendations, might have unintentionally created a similar loophole for today's elites.
A modern version of an old problem. And this isn't just about medicine or academia, is it? This feeling of blocked paths seems much broader.
Oh, absolutely. Think about that phrase, 3 generations of tobacco people. It's used to describe how certain lucrative industries, often state-controlled monopolies, become dominated by the same families generation after generation.
Passing down jobs and opportunities like heirlooms.
Exactly. And it's not just tobacco. You hear similar stories about railways, the power grid, water supply, banking, the postal service, even tax collection. These secure, well-paying jobs, the golden rice bowls, seem reserved for insiders, blocking out qualified people from ordinary families.
And it happens at a local level too, right? This idea of county Brahmins.
Yeah, that term captures how, in smaller cities or counties, just a few interconnected families can end up controlling almost everything. The key businesses, local government positions, the resources. It creates these little local fiefdoms of privilege.
Making it almost impossible for anyone else to break in.
Right. There is that anecdote about the little boy saying he wanted to grow up to be a bank manager, just like his dad and his granddad. It sounds innocent, but it reflects how deeply embedded this idea of inherited position can become.
Yeah.
It shapes what people even think is possible for themselves.
It's a cycle that seems incredibly hard to disrupt. The analysis even referenced alleged policies from figures like Chen Yun and Deng Xiaoping regarding CCP families.
Yes, it mentioned reports suggesting internal understandings or policies aimed at ensuring the families of the revolutionary generation maintained influence. The idea being, perhaps, that one child would go into politics, others into business, securing the family's position across different spheres.
A strategy for perpetuating power.
And the result, according to this perspective, was the formation of these incredibly powerful, intertwined elite groups controlling huge chunks of the economy and political landscape. There are claims, for instance, about the descendants of the 8 elders controlling vast state assets.
Which creates a massive disparity in opportunity compared to the average citizen.
Yeah.
It fuels that feeling that the cold door isn't just closed, it's locked and bolted from the inside.
And the analysis contrasted this with how things often work, or are supposed to work, in more democratic systems.
How so?
Well, the argument goes that things like genuinely open competitive exams for government jobs, a free press that can investigate and expose wrongdoing, and an independent judiciary can act as checks. They make it harder for privilege to become completely entrenched across generations.
Whereas here,
the suggestion is that a lack of transparency, things like internal rules operations and approval information wiping, basically operating behind closed doors and controlling information, actually helps the powerful maintain and pass on their advantages. It allows privilege to reproduce itself more easily.
it almost sounds like the creation of what Milovangelis called the new class, a privileged elite born out of the system itself.
That concept was definitely alluded to. The idea that a system theoretically based on equality has, in practice, generated its own powerful elite, which in turn hinders social mobility for everyone else. It's a fundamental contradiction.
Which brings us to a really puzzling question. If these officials, these elites, already have so much resources, power, advantages, why do they seem so determined to block the paths for ordinary people? Why hoard opportunity? What are they anxious about?
That's a tough one, and the materials don't give us direct quotes from officials explaining their anxieties, but we can speculate based on the patterns, right? Perhaps it's about self-preservation.
Really?
Maybe they worry about losing their own status or ensuring their children maintain that status in what they perceive as a very competitive, maybe even unstable environment. Perhaps a truly level playing field, real meritocracy, feels threatening to their entrenched positions.
So they pull up the ladder behind them.
It could be driven by a desire to secure every possible advantage for their own families. A belief that resources are finite and must be captured and held. Maybe there's even a fear that if too many capable people from the cold door rise up, it could disrupt the existing power structures they benefit from. It's a defensive posture, perhaps.
It leads back to those really stark contrasts we talked about. The 3 generations of tobacco people, the inherited bank manager positions, versus what? The reality for millions of others, maybe 3 generations of delivery drivers stuck in low-wage jobs with little hope of advancement.
That's the potential reality, isn't it? The analysis strongly conveyed that sense of blocked channels, saying explicitly, resources and channels have long been completely blocked by certain individuals. When people feel that intensely, that the system is fundamentally unfair.
It erodes everything. Trust in government, trust in institutions, maybe even trust in the idea of hard work paying off.
Absolutely. It can breed deep resentment, cynicism, and potentially social instability down the line. If people feel there's no legitimate way up, they lose faith in the system itself.
So looking back at the whole Miss Dong affair and the issues it's brought to the surface, what's the main takeaway? What's the awakening here?
I think it fundamentally underscores how vital real meritocracy is, especially in fields like medicine and education that touch everyone's lives. It shows the corrosive effect of unchecked privilege, of nepotism, of opacity. When these things take root, they don't just harm individuals, they damage the integrity of the entire system.
And they destroy public trust.
Exactly. When the perception becomes widespread that success depends on your background, not your ability, it undermines the social contract. It's a dangerous path.
It really leaves you, the listener, with some heavy questions to ponder, doesn't it? What happens to a society long-term when opportunity seems inherited rather than earned? And maybe more importantly, what can actually be done to push back against that? To create a genuinely more level playing field for everyone, regardless of where they start.
Those are the crucial questions we need to be asking, I think. Serious reflection is definitely needed.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into what turned out to be a very complex and, frankly, quite concerning issue.
Our aim is always to shed light on the topics you bring to us, using the information available.
We hope this gave you some clarity and food for thought. Please continue to reflect on these themes and, of course, keep sending us material for future deep dives. We appreciate you being part of the conversation.